In the previous lesson, we looked at the experience of Black Catholics from a high-level view. In this lesson, we will take a more intimate look at the Black Catholic experience. In 1958, the U.S. bishops denounced racial prejudice as immoral for the first time in a pastoral letter. The document was titled Discrimination and Conscience. The letter states, "The heart of the race question is moral and religious. It concerns the rights of man and our attitude toward our fellow man. If our attitude is governed by the great Christian law of love of neighbor and respect for his rights, then we can work out harmoniously the techniques for making legal, educational, economic, and social adjustments. But if our hearts are poisoned by hatred or even indifference toward the welfare and rights of our fellow men, then our nation faces a grave internal crisis." The bishops acknowledge that the racial problems the country faced are rooted in decades, even centuries, of custom and cultural patterns, and that it is a matter of historical fact that segregation in our country has led to oppressive conditions and the denial of basic human rights for the Negro. They also state that change in deep-rooted racist attitudes will not occur overnight. They suggest quiet conciliation as a path forward, while also eschewing gradualism as a cloak for inaction and rash impetuosity. They make a general appeal that responsible and sober-minded Americans of all faiths would seize the mantle of leadership from the agitator and the racist, and that all must act quietly, courageously, and prayerfully before it is too late. Meanwhile, the bishops themselves historically had not been overly supportive of Black men joining the priesthood. As far back as 1880, Venerable Augustus Tolton, the first publicly identified Black priest in the United States, had to attend seminary in Rome because no diocesan seminary in the United States would accept him. Venerable Tolton dealt with intense discrimination from white clergy and lay people when he returned to the United States to minister as a priest in 1886. Fast forward 71 years to Father August Thompson. A year before the U.S. bishops released their 1958 letter on discrimination, Father August Thompson graduated from seminary. He grew up in Louisiana in a devout Catholic family, and he discerned a calling to the priesthood. And while his white priest at the parish was supportive, his own diocese of Lafayette was not. Father graduated from seminary, but his bishop would not accept him as a priest. However, Bishop Greco of Alexandria, a nearby diocese, did accept him. Greco was the only Southern bishop willing to ordain him. Thompson has the distinction of being the first Black priest of the Alexandria diocese. The unjust treatment of Black Catholics in the diocese became a frequent flashpoint for the bishop and Father Thompson. Thompson was frank with the bishop about the treatment of Black people, so it was a surprise to Father Thompson that his equally frank interview in 1963 in Ramparts magazine with John Howard Griffin was met with anger from the bishop. The bishop went so far as to try to bar the publication of the interview, attempting to use both civil and canon law, but his efforts failed. Gregory Hillis discusses the interview and the fallout from it in his 2019 article, A Sign of Contradiction, which was published in Commonweal magazine. Hillis writes, "Unlike their white Catholic counterparts, Black Catholics could not attend retreats or days of recollection due to segregated facilities. Moreover, Black Catholics could only attend a white parish if the distance to the closest Black parish was considered inordinate. In one town where there was only one Black Catholic and no Black parishes, the white parish went so far as to pay someone to drive the Black Catholic to a Black parish in another town. And even if a white parish allowed Black Catholics to join because the distance to their parish was too far, they sat in a section segregated from the white parishioners and were allowed to receive the Eucharist only after the white Catholics had done so. Some white Catholics refused to call him Father, and he was often prohibited from attending certain churches for First Communions or confirmations. He was not even allowed to say Mass at many white parishes. And as the only Black priest in the diocese, he was rarely invited to events with his fellow priests. Regarding the church's response to racism in general, Father Thompson said, "I fear that the silence in some areas is quite loud. Many people think that this silence is a sign that those in authority agree with the situation as it exists." Father Thompson sums up the impact on the practice of the faith among Black Catholics. There are many Catholics who do not go to church because the pain of this kind of humiliation is simply unbearable. Think of going to church, going to communion, and in order to receive Christ, you must wait until every white Catholic has gone to the communion table and returned to his seat, knowing that you might well be skipped if you approached the altar while some white person was still there. Think of that, encouraging people to receive communion. Many do, of course, but with a deep sense of sickness and then resentment that even this great sacrament should be clouded in indignity for them. Father Thompson recognizes that the scandal not only negatively impacts Black people, but also white people. Each day, we see more Negroes disillusioned with what they call the white man's Christianity, and each day, we see more whites disillusioned by the same scandal. Let's not forget that. 5 years after the U.S. bishops published their 1958 letter denouncing discrimination, and shortly after Father Thompson's frank interview was published, Bishop Greco called Thompson's assessment of the situation exaggerated, distorted, and misleading, and constitutes defamation. He called the interview unjustified slander against the church, saying it was all the worse since it was committed by a priest consecrated to protect her interests. Greco concluded the letter with these words: "The church had done much for you as a Catholic and a priest, and you owe her all that you are today. But the image of your mother, the church, which you, her son, have projected to the world as unfair, is a disservice to her and has inflicted a deep wound upon her. We pray God we may be able to heal it." The racist attitudes toward Black Catholics were not limited to the South, as exemplified in Father Thompson's experience in 1967 in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Father Thompson preached a mission there, and the hosting priest contacted a fellow diocesan priest to offer to have Thompson speak to a CCD class. In response to the request, the hosting priest was told, "I don't want any N-word priests talking to my kids." Father Thompson remained a Catholic priest despite the daily threats he experienced: death threats from the KKK, the bombing of the houses and businesses of his friends and neighbors, and the hostility from his brother priests. Through it all, he had the heart of a priest. He expressed concern not only for Black Catholics, but also for white racists. Thompson would not go to the deathbed of white Catholics unless they had called for him. He feared that a person would commit an act of hatred against him on his or her deathbed, endangering their eternal salvation. His retirement from active ministry took place in 1997, and he suffered from dementia for the final years of his life. He died at the age of 93 in 2019. Racist attitudes were not just leveled at laity and priests, but also at Black bishops. According to Larry Peterson and Alatea, in 1966, amidst loud racial demonstrations outside, Harold Robert Perry was consecrated a bishop of the Roman Catholic Church. One demonstrator screamed, "This is another reason why God will destroy the Vatican." Perry became an auxiliary bishop in New Orleans. Some protesters held homemade signs expressing their opposition, including 2 signs with the following words: "Jesus did not choose non-white apostles," and "God does not recognize Negro priests and bishops." It is interesting to remember that the Catholic Church was the largest slaveholder in Louisiana in 1769, and nearly 200 years later, the impact of that choice was still being felt. In some cases, the protests against Black Catholics were by letter to the bishop, as documented in Real Good and Sincere Catholics by Matthew J. Kressler. In 1965 in Chicago, a letter was sent to Bishop Charles O'Donnell regarding a newspaper report depicting civil rights protests and a few priests and nuns being arrested with the civil rights protesters. The writer, who wished to remain anonymous for fear of excommunication, wrote, "Your Excellency, the news item in last night's Daily News prompts me to write this to you. First, to set the record straight, please do not be so mistaken as to believe that all the faithful in its archdiocese are accepting the integration problem. We are not. If a survey were taken, it would show shocking results in how many are against this serious act of integration. How can anyone, priest, bishop, or archbishop, or cardinal, expect such a difficult and unnatural acceptance for the ordinary, everyday layperson? Yes, this is easy for clergy, as they do not have children. They do not have to come in close contact with this race. They do not have to live with them and try to accept something so unnatural." Over a 4-year period, more than 600 letters expressing outrage and disgust with the church's support of integration were composed by white Catholic men and women and mailed to the Archbishop of Chicago. These letters were archived in boxes called race mail. According to Kressler, letter writers regularly described themselves as real good and sincere Catholics in the same sentences in which they reinforced a white supremacist racial order. Are you trying to push the white people out of the Catholic Church? We were born and raised in Chicago as Catholics. I go to communion almost every morning, but I will not attend Mass with any Negroes. One letter writer, who identified himself as Mr. George J. Burns, wrote, "We are the parents of 7 children in Catholic schools from kindergarten to a senior in college, and we are endeavoring to raise our boys and girls to be good Catholics, and certainly not with the intent of their later integrating and marrying people of a different color." In 1968, Mrs. Florence Flacco, identifying herself as a devout and practicing Roman Catholic, wrote to Cardinal Cody to protest most strongly your proposed busing of Negro children to parochial schools in the city and the suburbs. Agreeing in the abstract that all men are created equal in God's eyes, she went on to write, "Each one of us must earn the respect of our fellow man. This, Cardinal, the vast majority of Negroes have not done." There were some bishops who acted directly on racial justice before the bishop's 1958 pastoral letter on discrimination and Christian conscience. The Archbishop of St. Louis, Joseph Ritter, despite strong opposition, ended racial segregation in Catholic schools in 1947. Patrick O'Boyle, the Archbishop of Washington, did the same shortly after being appointed to the archdiocese. The Bishop of Raleigh, Vincent Waters, ended segregation in the parishes and other church institutions there in 1954. These all took place before legal segregation in schools was outlawed. It is eye-opening to see how much the stain of racism plagues the U.S. Church. I end with a few quotes from brothers and sisters to us, the U.S. Bishop's 1979 pastoral letter on racism. "The new forms of racism must be brought face to face with the figure of Christ. How great, therefore, is that sin of racism, which weakens the church's witness as the universal sign of unity among all peoples? How great the scandal given by racist Catholics who make the body of Christ, the church, a sign of racial oppression. Yet all too often, the church in our country has been for many a white church, a racist institution. Each of us as Catholics must acknowledge a share in the mistakes and sins of the past. Many of us have been prisoners of fear and prejudice. We have preached the gospel while closing our eyes to the racism it condemns. We have allowed conformity to social pressures to replace compliance with social justice. Let the church speak out, not only in the assemblies of the bishops, but in every diocese and parish in the land, in every chapel and religious house, in every school, in every social service agency, and in every institution that bears the name Catholic. Let the church proclaim to all that the sin of racism defiles the image of God and degrades the sacred dignity of humankind, which has been revealed by the mystery of the Incarnation. Let all know that it is a terrible sin that mocks the cross of Christ and ridicules the Incarnation. For the brother and sister of our brother Jesus Christ are brother and sister to us. Racism is not merely one sin among many. It is a radical evil that divides the human family and denies the new creation of a redeemed world. The struggle against it demands an equally radical transformation in our own minds and hearts, as well as in the structure of our society.